The following program was produced by a community producer.
All right. Well, Dr. Grandin, thank you so much for being here. We are honored that you're here. I'm just going to give a little background on you first before we get started.
So, and then we're doing an interview?
Yes, we are. An interview for about 30 minutes.
All right.
Q&A.
Okay, sorry about all the backlighting. We've got a lot of sun. It's really hot here.
No worries. Yeah. All right. So as one of the first to publicize her own experiences on the autism spectrum, Temple Grandin has found decades of success as both a renowned animal behaviorist and autism expert. In the 70s and 80s, she was able to design a more humane livestock equipment by understanding that her autism allowed her to relate to an animal's sensory experience. By the 90s, she published her first book on living with autism, Thinking in Pictures. As of today, Grandin has written over 60 academic papers on animal behavior and dozens of books on autism. She holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Franklin Pierce College, now Franklin Pierce University, a master's in animal sciences from Arizona State University, and a doctorate in animal sciences from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Her latest book, Visual Thinking, has been on the shelves since last year, and she is currently a professor of animal science at Colorado State University. Dr. Grandin, we are honored to have you with us today. Thank you for being here.
It's great to be here.
Of course. So the first thing I wanted to actually ask you is sort of this question about labels. I see in a lot of your books, in a lot of your talks, you express your sort of dissatisfaction with like how ADHD, dyslexia, and all of these sort of micro labels of conditions sort of screen out kids. Could you just sort of describe what issues you see in the current methods for diagnosing neurodivergency?
First of all, these diagnoses don't have like a blood test or something like that to show you that you have it. It's not like having tuberculosis where you either have it or you don't. It's a behavioral profile. In fact, it's a behavioral profile that's changed over the years. To be labeled autistic in the 80s, you had to have speech delay along with the autistic symptoms. And then in the early 90s, they added the Asperger's, which is socially awkward with no speech delay. And then in 2013, they put it all together. So now you're going from a geeky and nerdy computer programmer or Einstein to somebody who can't dress themselves, and it's all called autism. And what I see with a lot of parents, and I don't think this is good, is the kid gets a label, they don't think the kid can do anything. I mean, I'm seeing fully verbal kids that have never gone shopping by themselves. These are things that I did when I was 7 and 8 years old. And I have grandparents come up to me all the time and tell me they find out they're autistic when the kid's diagnosed. But growing up in the 50s and 60s, social rules were taught in a much more structured way. You were taught to say please and thank you. You were taught to shake hands. That's just something that kids were taught in the 50s.
And why do you think that's not around anymore as much?
Well, and I think it hurts the autistic kids more than it hurts the regular kids. The regular kids kind of pick it up by osmosis. But the autistic kid has to be taught to greet somebody and shake hands with them. That has to be specifically taught. The other thing I'm finding with these labels is silos. You can get sensory processing label, you can get dyslexia label, you can get a gifted label, you get autism. And when I go around to the different meetings and you look at the books on the book table, there's very, very little overlap. They really are in a silo with their label, even though sensory processing disorder and dyslexia and ADHD have a lot of crossover, lots of crossover.
So how would you suggest then, like in an ideal society, how do you think we should go about evaluating autism in kids?
Well, I think it's very important. Early intervention is really important. You got little kids that are 3 years old that are not talking. Something's wrong. Rule out deafness, rule out some problem with their throat or their mouth, and you need to get them into therapy. Lots of good one-on-one teaching with an effective teacher. So what's an effective teacher do? An effective teacher gets more speech, more turn taking, learning how to wait and take turn taking at games, Like little autistic kids, let's say they like to line things up. Well, you can have them take turns lining up the blocks or lining up the cars, whatever the thing is they like to line up. And then skills, eating with utensils, dressing, basic skills. I mean, that's what you want out of 3-year-olds. I don't think eye contact is very important. In fact, that causes sensory overload in a lot of these little kids. It's also important to slow down when you talk to them and give the child time to respond. They're like a phone with only 1 bar of service. It takes time to download the web page. You've got to give them time. Really, really important. And the worst thing you could do with a 3-year-old is not talking. Is just let them sit in the corner and veg out on electronics. That's the thing not to do.
Yeah, and that's actually, I wanted to ask you about that because, as we know, we've experienced a huge pandemic over the last several years. It's sort of done now, depending on who you talk to. But I think, my question to you is like, how do you think those social constraints in the pandemic, quarantine, not being able to see people, you have to be on a screen for school. How do you think that impacted neurodivergent
kids? I think
it
made it worse. I think it made it worse because these kids were not out socializing. I just talked to a mom just the other day, and she was kind of nervous because her little kid was going to go off the first day of kindergarten. And she went to pick up her kid. This is just her normal kid. And the kid was so happy out on the playground, was loving kindergarten. And I just heard about that just the other day. And the children during the pandemic weren't getting those kind of experiences. I think it was the younger the kid, I think the worse it was.
And how do you think it impacted like autistic children specifically?
Well, they just don't know how to communicate with each other. I would say for the age group, I don't think it mattered to tiny infants, but I think like the 3-year-olds and the 6-year-olds, I think it was really bad for that age group.
Do you know what that developmentally leads to, that kind of isolation?
I think we're just going to have to work on, trying to make up. The other thing I'm a big proponent of is let's work on what the kid is good at. I was good at art. That showed up when I was about 8 years old. My mother always encouraged my ability in art. And I would just draw the same horse head over and over again. And mother encouraged me to draw lots of different things, not just the same horse head over and over again. And another kid might be extremely good at math. Then give them more advanced math books.
Yeah. So in terms of like our education system, then, like, how do you think, like, what would you want to see implemented to nurture those different ways of thinking, especially?
Well, let's have some flexibility. I'm not suggesting putting a 3rd grader in a high school math class, but there might be a 3rd grader that needs a laptop with a math class on it. Yeah. And that's not a difficult thing to do, and I don't want a bureaucratic reason why they can't do it. Because if you make them do the baby math, they're just going to become behavior problems. In fact, in my book, Visual Thinking, the hidden gifts of people who think in pictures, patterns, and abstractions, I talk about 3 kinds of thinkers. And this is going to show up around 6, 7, and 8, not in 3-year-olds. I'm an object visualizer. Everything I think about is in pictures. That made me really good at working with animals because they live in a sensory-based world. So object visualizers tend to be good at photography, animals, mechanical devices, and art, and terrible at algebra because there's nothing to visualize. Then you have your mathematical minds. They're your pattern thinkers, computer programmer, physicists, chemists, excel in math. They think in patterns. And then, of course, you have word thinkers who think in words. And lots of people are mixtures. But when you get a kid with a label, you might get an extreme object visualizer, an extreme mathematician, or an extreme word thinker. And I'm very concerned, especially my kind of mind, who's good at mechanics, that us object visualizers getting screened out because we can't do algebra. I've worked with people that building great big beef plants and have a corporate jet, and they can't do algebra. They just started building things.
Absolutely. So speaking of, these different ways of thinking, you proved, I think about a decade ago now, that with brain scans that autistic people, like the makeup of the brain in an autistic individual is typically a lot different than sort of a normal.
Well, in one of my earlier books, The Autistic Brain, I put my brain scans in there, and I had huge extra circuits for visual thinking. And I think the first step that you have to realize that some kids think differently. And let's say you take the little mathematics kids. The teachers will want them to show their work all sequential. It's not how these kids think. They just see the answer. All you do is frustrate them when you make them show the work. They don't think the same way. And I've heard this complaint over and over and over again from parents that have kids that are the little math brains. And then my kind of thinker needs to grow up using tools and lots of hands-on stuff. Well, if the schools have taken those things out, then the child doesn't have a chance to show that they'd be good at those things. And we've actually got a huge skill loss right now in mechanics. And somebody was asking me just the other day about how do we get the politicians interested? I said, you need kind of my kind of mind. Politicians aren't going to like getting stuck in the elevator maybe for a weekend. They wouldn't like that.
Yeah.
So maybe the person that can't do the algebra is going to keep the elevator running.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask you, why did you decide to get those brain scans then, and what is the importance of publicizing them?
It was just curiosity, and the work has never been followed up on. Basically, what it was is scientists messing around with the fanciest scanner, and the thing is that scanner is sitting in every hospital now. It's no longer state of the art, and it's not being used for that purpose. There's actually been very little interest in it. But you can also, the thing that showed up with all the brain scan stuff, everything that showed up on a brain scan also showed up just in the classroom. Working memory issues, like one of the little tips is I have no working memory. So it's very difficult for me to remember long strings of verbal instruction. It's much better to give me a pilot's checklist. Step 1, step 2, step 3. Let me write down the steps. Because I do not remember long strings of verbal information. That's a very simple accommodation too. That would save a lot of jobs. Lots and lots of jobs.
Yeah. And so as I hear you talking about, autistic people finding their strengths and therefore sort of these places in our society, I'm just thinking about there's a lot of studies as well on how with women with autism right now and how they're kind of getting missed in their evaluations and their screenings. And there's a lot of theories right now as to why. But they're finding that women who actually do have autism, it's much harder for them to get diagnosed. Why do you believe that is so? And what do you think we can do about it?
Well, lots of times the symptoms in women aren't as obvious. They're just not as obvious. And one of the big problems a lot of women have is getting in abusive relationships. That's been a big problem for a lot of women on the spectrum.
Do you know why that is?
The thing is where I've had friends who shared interests. When I was getting bullied and teased in high school, the one place where I had friends was horseback riding, model rockets, and electronics. And the kids that were interested in those things were not the kids who did the bullying. But that's where I think most autistic people are going to get their friends, is where you work on things where there's a shared interest.
Yeah. And how do you think we can sort of further develop those shared interests besides within the school environment? Like what can parents do to sort of encourage their children?
Well, one thing Mother did with me is I was just drawing the same horse head over and over again when I was 6 and 7 years old. And she said, well, let's draw the entire horse. Let's draw the stable. Take that interest and broaden. If a child likes cars, and that's a very common interest, do math with cars. Let's draw cars. Let's read about how they work. Let's read about the history of the car industry. These are all things that you can do.
So just being encouraging, pretty much.
Well, you instead of trying to stomp out the fixation, broaden it. And horses are cars, airplanes. Those are trains. Those are very common interests, and those things can all turn into careers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I kind of want to take it back to sort of diagnosing autism. There's this discourse going on right now. When I read your book, Visual Thinking, I noticed you mentioned TikTok a few times. And so there's a lot of things going on TikTok right now about whether or not it's okay to sort of self-diagnose with autism. Because as we talked about, women with autism, they're less likely to be diagnosed, or sometimes people don't have the financial resources to get evaluated.
Well, I think that people can read stuff and figure out whether or not they're autistic. I've got another book called Different Not Less, and it's 18 older people diagnosed later in life. And they found that it helped with their relationships. I think sometimes the label is holding people back. Here it is right here, Different Not Less. I think sometimes the label's holding people back on the career front. But it's 18 adults later in life telling about getting diagnosed. They all have jobs. I'm seeing too many kids where they'll do well academically, but on the job front, it's just terrible because they're not learning any working skills. They've got to learn how to do a task on a schedule outside the home. Really, really important. That can start with church volunteer job, farmer's market volunteer job, walking the next door neighbor's dog, somebody else's dog, where somebody else is the boss. That needs to start at around 11. Then the instant illegal, they need to get jobs like bagging groceries or, real jobs.
So you don't see, correct me if I'm wrong, but you don't really find any benefit to getting in a sort of a quote unquote official diagnosis. Like,
I didn't say I'm against an official diagnosis.
No,
there's a lot of people that if you read enough books, you'll know. It is a behavioral profile. There's no medical test for it. And so you read enough books, you can figure out that you're on the spectrum.
My generation's very much caught up in these sort of online discourses where, they don't think that you should describe yourself as neurodivergent or autistic if you haven't been officially diagnosed. And so I just wanted to ask you your opinion on that, because clearly there are extenuating circumstances where you can't get officially diagnosed.
If you want to get services, you're going to have an official diagnosis. You see, and a lot of kids, like little kids get a diagnosis, so they have to get for the school to give services. But the thing is, autism is a real continuous trait. You're going from slightly nerdy to much more severe. It's a true continuous trait with a strong genetic background.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then I also just wanted to ask you with that self-diagnosis, like, so if you want to get services for autism, what do those services look like for someone who needs
all right, like in a school. I mean, let's say you want to be getting a therapy for a little kid and have insurance pay for it. You're going to have a diagnosis in order for insurance to pay for therapy for a little kid. That has to be an official diagnosis for that. Or to get the school to make an individual educational plan and that stuff. That has to be officially diagnosed to get that service.
How difficult is it currently in like America's public school system?
It depends upon the state. It depends upon the school. It's so variable. It varies so much.
Got it. Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about, could you just reiterate your different types of thinking as well on your...
Discuss the different kinds of thinking. I talk about in my visual thinking book, The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. Well, for a lot of people, it's a real eye-opener to discover that different kinds of thinking exist. I think in pictures, I didn't know that verbal thinking existed until I was in my late 30s. And that was a shock to me. You see, if I think about church steeples, I see them and I name off where they're at. The verbal thinker might just see 2 lines. That's all. Okay, so the 3 kinds of thinking are object visualizer, and there's a whole chapter in visual thinking on the types of the object visualizer. The second type is visual spatial pattern thinker, and then the third type, of course, the word verbal thinker. And the object visualizers, all my thoughts are in photorealistic pictures. And the kinds of things that my kind of mind's good at is art, mechanical devices, things like fixing cars. One of the ways to get the video game addicts off the video games has been car mechanics. It has worked. Photography and animals. And then your mathematician mind, your pattern thinker, visual spatial chemistry, physics, music, Music and math go together. And then of course, you have people that think in words. And I do a lot of talks to businesses. And I tell businesses that one of the first things we need to be doing is you've got to realize that different kinds of thinking exist. That's the thing. Know they exist.
Absolutely.
Okay, somebody has a question in the chat there about work with animals. Maybe I should go ahead and answer that question
absolutely.
right now. I get asked all the time how I ended up with livestock. I got exposed to them as a teenager. And that brings up a very important thing about careers. Students get interested in stuff they get exposed to. I came from a non-ag background. So all of the cattle exposure was as a teenager. And when I first started working with feed yards in Arizona, handling of cattle was awful. It was totally awful. And that was something that I wanted to change. And when I first started, I thought I could fix everything with equipment. I thought I could build a self-managing system. There's no such thing as that. You need to have good equipment, but you have to have the management to go along with it, the training to go along with it. That is just so important.
Absolutely. I've got one last question for you before I officially hand it off to the Q&A. This is a little off topic, but you are an animal behaviorist. And so you specialized in designing livestock equipment. And I want to ask you, we just saw a hurricane reach California. Climate change is a huge issue right now. How do you see the livestock industry being impacted by climate change and animal behavior as a result?
Well, you're going to have more heat stress for one thing. I think some of the feed yards need to get shade. And a really easy way to make shade for cattle is solar panels. They make excellent shade and they generate electricity. So you get kind of dual use there, and the shades will pay for themselves.
Very, very cool.
That's something that has to be done. I'm very concerned also about some of the breeding of animals, both farm animals and pet animals. I think it's really bad to breed a pug that has difficulty breathing because you want a flat face. That's not okay. Or if we just breed cattle that be bigger and bigger muscles, you get problems with lameness and heart failure. That's not okay. And I'm going to, when it comes to breeding, I'm going to bash pets just as much as I bash the farm animals because they both have problems with over-selecting for single traits. I have my animal books on Animals in Translation, and then I talk more about some of the animal welfare issues in my other book, Animals Make Us Human. Discuss a lot of animal welfare issues.
All right. Well, our audience is teeming with questions, so I am going to hand it off to my coworker Sharon. And she is going to handle the Q&A aspect. Once again, thank you, Dr. Grandin.
So you're putting the questions up right now and going to continue on with the questions?
Does anyone have a question about anything about autism? Okay, we don't have anything in the audience just yet, so we can hand it back to you, Sydney. Okay, we have one. We actually have one. Would you like to come up? Take your time. Okay, hang on.
I want to know about these vaccines. I know 2 kids that were fine till they got their 2.5-year shot. Then they were like comatose. So
I don't want to discuss that issue. Go to Google Scholar and look it up.
Okay.
PubMed database.
Okay. All right. I'm just curious.
I don't touch that potato.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. Would you like a question? We have another question here in the studio audience.
And I'm probably going to be getting my flu shot real soon. And I got all my COVID shots. I'm glad I did the age I'm at.
Thank you. Dr. Grandin, speaking college.
I believe it. I was really anxious to get them as a senior in my 70s.
Here I am, college teacher to college teacher. Children who are autistic grow up to become college students and young adults who are autistic. Since you teach in college, what have you learned that maybe can help me work with adult students who are on the spectrum?
All right, let's look at some accommodations that sometimes come up. About 10 to 20% of dyslexics Autistics and ADHD can see flicker on LED lights. It's a subtype. And if you have lights in a classroom that flicker, it doesn't bother everybody, only about 10 or 20%. But one of the ways to deal with that, we put a lamp next to the desk with an LED in it that does not flicker. And the way you can find flickering LED lights is to photograph the classroom with slow motion video from your phone. Don't use ultra slow motion, just regular slow motion video, video it with your phone. I would say that lighting problem can be a big problem. And then some people, when they go to read, they can see the print jiggle on the page. I don't have this problem, but I know people that do have it. And one of the things that can be very, very helpful is printing a book on like pale light blue paper. Pale, this is my children's project book, Calling All Minds. So you look at that pale blue paper there on the back. You know, try different pale pastels, lavender, gray, tan. Sometimes that's helpful. Another thing that can really help at work is pilot's checklists. I mean, let's say you have a job where you've got to tear down the ice cream machine at McDonald's and clean it. Make a pilot's checklist. Tear down steps, cleaning steps, reassembly steps. Just to jog the memory. That would save a lot of jobs. Very, very simple accommodation that would help a lot of jobs. The other thing is, for a student that's in college, they need to start learning working skills. So we ideally have a slow transition from the world of school to the world of work. So if your child's just starting out in junior high, I'd like to start that transition then. But let's say you have students in college, no working skills. While they're in college, they need to be getting some working skills, like get a part-time job, maybe work a little lower load. The other thing on the jobs, I want to avoid the rapid multitasking jobs, like a McDonald's takeout window. Just don't go there. Find calmer, quieter jobs. But those are some of the simplest accommodations that come up all the time. I became a very good note taker. That was how I handled long strings of verbal information.
We've actually got a question in the chat here. It's from Emily. She says, could you please discuss reasonable accommodations in the workforce and how you advocated for yourself when you were younger and working?
Well, I didn't even realize I was doing it, but I was designing equipment. And so one of the things I would do in a project meeting is write down, what do you want this piece of equipment to do? You know, I would write it down. And I also did some advertising layout, and I made some brochures. And I'd write down what they wanted that brochure to cover. That was something that was really helpful.
Okay, are there any other questions in the audience, Sharon?
Do we have any other? Okay, we have one more. Come on up. Take your time.
Hi, so, okay. So I'm wondering about, I've read about the correlation between epilepsy and seizures in autism. Is that, like, correct? And if so, would you?
Yes, there is. There is a relationship. I mean, I fortunately didn't have epilepsy, but there's quite a few cases where the little kid will have epilepsy, or maybe epilepsy starts in adolescence. Yeah, there is a relationship there. In fact, if you want to look, you can go on to Google Scholar or the PubMed database and type in autism and epilepsy. You'll find a lot of papers.
Anyone else have any questions? No questions? Okay. No more questions here.
Now, most of the people that are in your audience right now, are they in college or what?
There are a couple, and it's a small in-house audience. A lot of people are at home, but we have two. You're in college, right? Oh, high school. Oh,
okay, so
but college age.
But the big problem I'm finding, I'm seeing a lot of situations where they're doing a really good job with academics, where kids will be in college, in high school, really good academics, and nothing being done to train work skills, daily life skills, things like shopping, bank account, doing laundry, just living skills.
I just have a question, Dr. Grandin. Do you think that should be, I believe in high school it was called home ec. Do you believe that
Yes,
should
I
be
think
brought?
the worst thing that schools ever did is taking these classes out. People ask me all the time, what would I do to fix the schools? I'd put all the hands-on classes back into the schools. That's what I would do.
Perhaps we
Stop
can.
sewing, woodworking, cooking, art, music, theater. All these things I put back in the schools. I think taking them out has been really bad.
Perhaps we will bring this up to the Malden school superintendent because it may make a difference knowing that there is a connection to helping children on the spectrum assimilate, adequately, bringing these programs back. Anyone else have any
I
questions?
have a question if no one else will keep going. Dr. Grandin, this is a little off topic, but as an animal behaviorist, what are your thoughts on those pods of orcas off the coast of Spain, like just hitting boats and trying to capsize them?
Wait a minute, what was trying to capsize boats?
Did you hear about the whales off the coast of Spain
Whales were
this
trying
summer?
to capsize boats.
Yeah. Did you hear about this?
No, I didn't hear about that.
So there were a series of this past summer, like it started in May. There was a pod of whales that started like ramming hulls of ships and like yachts, like these super yachts off the coast of Spain. And so it became this sort of, and a lot of experts think that they're trying to teach other pods to do the same thing.
Oh,
And so it became,
you can get observational learning in animals. And that's how like bears learned how to like get into dumpsters. Bears, see, in the 60s, bears didn't know they could break into cars. They didn't know they could take that big paw and just swat a car window. And they didn't used to break into cars. You see, that was something that they learned by observational learning. They can just rip the front door off a house.
And so why do you think they were attacking ships?
Maybe
that's kind of a
ships
working
did something to them. You see, there's usually a reason for it. It doesn't just happen. Maybe the ships were harassing them.
Mm-hmm.
See, I don't know. I'd have to look that up, and probably a lot of it's written in Spanish, and I won't be able to read it, but there's usually a reason for stuff like that. Now, let's look at the thing. Emily Borden has a question. How did I do things like getting on time, being to work on time? In the 50s, being on time was just pounded into me. That was not one of my issues, getting to work on time. Now, I did have some issues about hygiene, and one of my bosses had to tell me really bluntly to use deodorant. That's shown in the movie. This is where there's a little conformity is needed. On hygiene, you've got to clean it up. Just that simple. One of the reasons I didn't use deodorant, because in the 70s, they had these gunky roll-ons, and I hated the feeling of them. But now I just use solid stick. You can't even feel it. There's no excuse for not using it.
I wanted to actually ask you about the movie because every time you talk about it, you seem to really like and enjoy how they represent your kind of thinking.
Oh, it shows that accurately. That is shown accurately in the movie. It's probably the most accurate thing in the movie is that visual thinking is shown accurately.
Yeah.
In the HBO.
What are your thoughts on someone neurotypical playing someone with autism? Do you care or?
Well, at the time that the movie was put together, which was in 2008, 2009, unfortunately at that time, it wasn't even on anybody's radar at that time. Now, I think Claire Danes did a marvelous job in becoming me. In fact, she did so well in becoming me that when I heard an NPR show online, they were interviewing me and then having lines from the movie, and I almost mixed me up with Claire on the NPR. Wow. I mean, she did just a fantastic job becoming me. Now, I had the blind roommate in there. Yes, that should have been a blind person. And that just, unfortunately, at that time, it just wasn't on the radar. If we were doing it now, that part definitely should have been a blind person, because that was a small part. But the thing is, the other thing is, I mean, Claire did such a good job. because she got her, what she did is she got all these old VHS tapes I had, like 1980s VHS tapes that they made into CDs for her, and she played them over and over and over again. And then I interviewed with her for 4 hours, and she videotaped the entire thing. And she played that stuff over and over again with an acting coach and a movement coach, and she became me. I just, it was like a weird time machine when I first saw her.
Absolutely. Yeah. What was, actually, sorry, we've got something in the chat here. What was detrimental to your learning that adults thought was helpful, but actually was the exact opposite?
What was detrimental to my learning? Well, they tried to pound algebra into me, and that was just hopeless. I'm very concerned about visual thinking, visual thinkers getting screened out. We should have jumped to geometry and trig. I think I could have done better at that. And what should have been done with my math is to connect formulas back to real things. Like, for example, in trigonometry, you have like a suspension bridge, and there's trig functions in that. See, now that's something I understand because I can see the bridge. Okay, pi times the radius squared for sizing hydraulic cylinders. Okay, that I know how to do. You see, that's putting a formula back to something specific. It's not just in the abstract. But I think one of the reasons why some people are hanging on to algebra and thinking it's so important is they think that you need algebraic thinking to think. That's not how I think. Algebra is not how I think. But I think the people that are more mathematically inclined use it for thinking.
Yeah. All right. Someone in the chat asked,
how do you create habits? Well, I had a habit I had to create recently because I injured my rotator cuff of all the dumb things on an airport shuttle bus door of all things. And I had to learn to open doors with my left hand because I wanted my rotator to heal. I didn't really want to do shoulder surgery and have a styrofoam box on my arm for 6 weeks. And so I had to train myself to any hard things to use my left hand, especially door opening, because this motion was hurting the rotator cuff. And I found I just, in the beginning, after about 3 or 4 days, I was opening doors with my left hand. I didn't want to have shoulder surgery. It's that simple. And it's healed enough so that if I'm careful with it, I think it's going to be fine. But I can't be like when I throw my garbage bags in the dumpster, I have them in my left hand, I swing them like this, and I swing them, and I swing them, and I swing them, and then I get up in the dumpster, and I don't use my right arm for that anymore. Yeah, I didn't want to have rotator cuff surgery. Don't do anything that hurts it. Sort of a virtual sling. Yeah, I taught myself to open doors with my left hand. Now I don't even think about it because you get a heavy door with a door closer on it, and you're going like this. That hurt it. I knew if I did that, I was going to have rotator cuff surgery, and I didn't want rotator cuff surgery. Okay, that's a new habit right there.
Yeah. There, as you're talking about
last year.
Very cool. I think, as you're talking about your physicality, there's a lot of studies recently that sort of suggest that people with autism or ADHD or neurodivergency are more likely to be hypermobile or have hypermobility in their joints. Do you know anything about that research?
Well, my joints were always kind of stiff, and I never could sit in the cross-legged position, like the yoga position. I could never sit in that position. I would sit with my legs like this. When I'd sit down, we'd play a game on the floor. My joints are kind of stiff, but yeah, there are some that have hypermobile joints. Yep, I've seen that. Okay, now somebody asked again about what the 3 ways of thinking are. I thought I explained it. They are object visualizer, that's thinking in photorealistic pictures, terrible at abstract math, visual spatial, pattern mathematical musical, and then verbal word. And then there are mixtures. A lot of people are mixtures.
Do you believe that everyone sort of to a certain extent has these thinking patterns mixed in, and then those who are diagnosed with autism just have a very skewed sense
what I
of like
think happens
very
with
trauma born.
autism is so-called normal people have a lot more mixtures. What happens in autism is you can get an extreme object visualizer with very uneven skills, an extreme mathematician, or you can get this extreme verbal thinker who memorizes all the facts about history or movie stars or some other thing that they're interested in.
So that skewedness would be the gauge for how to kind of understand the autism or sort of evaluate the autism.
Well, you get a person that it's extreme. And now therapeutic writing. A lot of times the autistic person, you just show them how to do something. One basic principle with autistic kids is no surprises. Surprises scare, oftentimes. And let's say you have a problem with noise. Now, you can't always control whether a horse is going to whinny, but you can control a noisy thing like a vacuum cleaner. And if the child can turn it on and off himself, that vacuum cleaner might go from the most scary, awful thing to their favorite thing to play with.
I know too that you there is an equine center at Colorado State
right.
named after you. How involved are you with that that facility?
Well, I go up there occasionally, but we've got very, very good staff there. Oh, by the way, they're hiring writing instructors right now, PATH certified writing instructors. They're hiring right now. And one of the mistakes I see in working with special ed kids is to say good job too often, to where it kind of breaks the flow of the activity. And I found that when I was kind of doing just, trying out, working with some of those kids on horses, I had to fight that urge to just say good job too often and just try to engage the kid. A good instructor knows how to engage the kid. I call it the neck. And they just know how to engage them. And you got to push a little bit, but if you push too hard, you cause sensory overload. You don't want to be doing that. Sometimes with a new activity, it's a good idea to have the child watch other people do it for a while. I have to do a talk where I've got to go talk to dentists. And one of the things I think could help that is to let the child watch somebody else having their teeth done. So it's not such a surprise.
Do you ride horses often currently?
No, I don't. I'm really worried about falling off now at the age I'm at.
Mm-hmm. But you rode for a while.
Broken bones if I fell off now.
Emily again asked a question. She said, do you have an opinion on the autistic person versus, sorry, let me redo that. Do you have an opinion on the autistic versus person with autism language?
I know a lot of advocates rather say autistic than person with autism. My very first book, Emergence, was called Labeled Autistic, that I did back in the 80s. Before anybody even thought about this. Now sometimes when you're writing something, you kind of got to switch them back and forth, or your writing gets too kind of, the same. But since the advocates want to say autistic person, then I'll say it.
Someone else asked, what do you find similar between animals and the autistic brain?
Well, the main thing is animals do not have verbal language. In fact, in visual thinking, I have a whole chapter in there on animal consciousness. And an animal's world is sensory-based. What is it? Seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling. There's some evidence now that dogs maybe think in three-dimensional smell pictures, because it's a big trunk line from the visual cortex to the olfactory nerves. To understand animals, you have to get away from words. And if you think in pictures, that's not thinking in words. Because I think some people that think in words, that are very, very big word thinkers, have a hard time imagining how a dog could be conscious. I think sometimes that can be a problem.
Absolutely. I do also have a question for you about so for verbal thinkers, would their type of thinking just be sort of an inner monologue where just their thoughts are verbalized
Oh, I can
consistently?
sometimes I would sometimes talk out loud when I was designing things. I would say, well, we could just do the concrete forms like this, and then put the rebar in like this. I would sometimes talk to myself, but I'm also seeing it as I drew it. I see it.
Sharon, do we have any questions in the audience?
Do we have any more? Do we have any more in the audience? Nope, there's no more out here. We're good here. Thank you, Dr. Grandin.
Okay, well, I hope that I'm giving people some things that they can take home and use. And we have, if we have some parents, people here with real little kids, they might be interested in this book the way I see it. This has got a lot of good information, especially if you're working with younger children.
Absolutely.
When you want to understand the different kinds of thinking, it's in my book on visual thinking.
Someone else asked in the chat, is there an animal that you feel best connects with autism?
Well, there's a lot of dogs that connect really well with autism. And I was just talking to somebody this morning that said that when their autistic kid goes out in the pasture, the cattle just get along with them just fine.
Interesting. Yeah. So,
but there's a dogs, but there's a lot of dogs that connect really well with children with autism.
why do you think that dogs are so are able to connect so well?
We've bred dogs to be very, very socially cued into people. And then let's look at the job front here. One of the things I learned is I learned to sell my work instead of myself. I would just show here this kind of torn up copy. There's one of my drawings right there, page out of one of my books that got ripped up. What I learned to do was to show my work. Go in and show the drawings off, show pictures of jobs, sell the work rather than selling myself.
And you would say that is that principle allowed you to sort of find success?
Well, and I did, a lot of my work was done freelance. Now, you see a lot of people that have been really good on job fronts, like started their own businesses. And one of the things I strongly recommend is getting help on setting up the business part of the business. That's really important. Somebody has to just make the business operate. But there's a lot of people that I worked with that were autistic, that owned metalworking shops, and they were very successful.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Dr. Grandin, I think those are all the questions that we have. Thank you again so much. We're honored to have you with us today. This was a great interview, and it was an honor speaking with you.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, and I hope I've helped some people out. And it was good to be here tonight.
Urban Media Arts.